Elara stared at the man sitting across from her, biting back the urge to cringe as he loudly slurped his soup. She had been on bad dates before, but this was a disaster. "So, Elara," her blind date Jason drawled, leaning back in his chair with a self-satisfied grin. "What do you bring to the table?" She blinked. "Excuse me." "You know," he said, waving his spoon around carelessly, nearly splashing soup onto the pristine white tablecloth. "What do you have to offer?" "I mean, I work in finance, I make good money, and I hit the gym 5 times a week." "What about you?" Elara inhaled sharply, gripping the edge of her napkin. She had been set up by her well-meaning friend, but this was beyond awkward. Jason had spent the last 20 minutes talking about himself, his job, his workouts, his expensive watch, and now he was treating her like some sort of business investment. "I'm a graphic designer," she said, forcing a polite smile. Jason made a non-committal sound. "Huh, not bad, I guess, but do you plan on staying in that field? Or are you looking for a man to take care of you?" Elara's patience snapped. She was about to respond when a deep, velvety voice interrupted. "Sorry to intrude, but I couldn't help overhearing." Elara turned, startled, and her breath caught. The man standing beside their table was effortlessly handsome tall, with sharp cheekbones, piercing blue eyes, and dark brown hair that had just the right amount of tousle. Dressed in a tailored black suit and an expensive watch that he wore with an air of complete nonchalance, he exuded power and confidence. Jason scowled. "Who the hell are you?" The stranger ignored him and turned to Elara instead, his expression warm and amused. "You looked like you needed saving." Elara blinked up at him, torn between mortification and relief. The man turned his attention back to Jason, his smile polite but firm. "I think this date is over. She deserves better," Jason scoffed. "And what? You're going to swoop in and be her knight in shining armor?" The man didn't flinch. "Something like that." Jason rolled his eyes and threw his napkin onto the table. "Whatever." "She's not that great anyway." Elara bristled, but before she could say anything, the man at her side spoke again, his tone ice cold. "Leave." Maybe it was the authority in his voice or the sheer presence he commanded, but Jason grabbed his coat and stomped off without another word. Elara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Wow, that was unexpected." The man smiled, pulling out the chair Jason had vacated and settling into it. "You seemed like you needed an escape." She studied him, curiosity flickering in her gaze. "And you just happened to be here." He leaned back, the corner of his lips curving up. "I was having dinner a few tables away. Your date was impossible to ignore." Elara let out a short laugh. "Yeah, he was something all right." The man extended his hand. "Emerson Blackwood." She hesitated before shaking it. His grip was firm, warm, and entirely too steady for someone who had just barged into a stranger's date. "Elara Hayes." "Nice to meet you, Elara." His gaze held hers, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. She tilted her head. "So, do you make a habit of rescuing women from terrible dates?" He chuckled. "Not usually. But you looked like you were plotting an escape, and I figured I'd make things easier for you." Elara exhaled, shaking her head in disbelief. "Well, thank you, I owe you one." His smile widened. "How about letting me buy you dinner instead?" She blinked. "You want to have dinner with me? Unless you'd rather cut the night short after that disaster." He gestured toward Jason's now empty seat. Elara studied him, trying to figure out if this was some sort of joke. He was charming, confident, and had just saved her from one of the worst dates of her life. And now he was offering her what seemed to be an actual enjoyable evening. She found herself nodding. "Okay, why not?" Emerson signaled for the waiter, effortlessly taking control of the situation. "Let's start fresh, then." As the waiter approached, Elara couldn't shake the feeling that her night had just taken a very unexpected turn. Elara wasn't sure what surprised her more, the fact that Emerson Blackwood had so effortlessly taken control of the evening, or the fact that she had agreed to it without hesitation. The moment the waiter arrived, Emerson ordered for both of them with an ease that suggested he was used to making decisions. Yet he paused before finalizing the order, glancing at her as if silently asking for her approval. It wasn't just confidence, it was consideration. The night took on a surreal quality as they settled into easy conversation. Unlike Jason, Emerson didn't launch into a monologue about himself. Instead, he asked her about her work, her passions, her favorite places in the city, and he listened, really listened. Elara found herself talking more than she had in months, sharing stories about how she'd started as a freelance graphic designer, how she loved creating art that told a story, how she dreamed of one day opening her own design studio. Emerson took it all in, his expression thoughtful. "You're not just talented," he said after a moment. "You have vision." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "That's a nice way of saying I spend too much time daydreaming." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Visionaries change the world, Elara. Never downplay that." A strange warmth spread through her chest. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her like that, like her dreams weren't just whimsical thoughts, but something real. Something possible. She studied him more closely. Everything about him exuded refinement, from the crisp lines of his suit to the effortless way he carried himself. Yet there was something else beneath the polished exterior, a sharpness, a depth, and despite the undeniable command he held over any room he walked into, he didn't make her feel small. As the meal progressed, she found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't expected. The awkward disaster of earlier felt like a distant memory. Then, the waiter returned with the check. Emerson reached for it without hesitation. Elara shook her head. "You really don't have to, I want to." His tone left no room for argument. She hesitated, then offered a small smile. "Thank you for everything." He inclined his head slightly, a gesture so smooth it was almost regal. "It was my pleasure." As they stepped outside, the cool night air wrapped around them. The city buzzed around them, headlights streaking through the darkness, laughter spilling from nearby restaurants. Elara turned to him, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "So do you always make a habit of rescuing strangers?" A flicker of amusement crossed his features. "Only when they look like they're suffering." She exhaled a small laugh, shaking her head. "Well, I appreciate it, but seriously, why did you step in?" He was silent for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "Because I know what it's like to sit across from someone who doesn't see your worth." Something in his tone made her chest tighten. There was a weight there, a history she didn't yet understand. Before she could ask more, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The kind of car that looked as if it belonged to someone important, someone powerful. The driver stepped out and opened the door for Emerson. Elara blinked. "You have a driver?" He hesitated, then gave a half smile. "I do." It was such an unassuming answer, yet it spoke volumes. Emerson Blackwood wasn't just confident, he was wealthy, more than wealthy. She wasn't sure why that realization made her pulse quicken. "Let me drive you home," he said. "It's late." She hesitated, torn between practicality and pride, but the truth was she didn't want the night to end just yet. "Okay." The moment she slid into the car, she realized just how different his world was from hers. The interior was pristine, the scent of leather and expensive cologne lingering in the air. As the car pulled away from the curb, she glanced at him. "So, Emerson Blackwood, what exactly do you do?" He studied her for a moment, as if debating how much to reveal. Then he finally said, "I run a private investment firm." That explained a lot, his confidence, his presence, his wealth. "You don't seem like the typical finance guy," she mused. He let out a quiet chuckle. "And what does the typical finance guy seem like?" "I don't know, more robotic." His lips curved slightly. "I assure you, I'm very human." Something in the way he said it sent a shiver down her spine. The city lights blurred past the window as they drove in comfortable silence. When they finally pulled up in front of her apartment building, she turned to him, suddenly uncertain of how to end the night. Thank you again, she said. For everything, his gaze lingered on hers. It was a pleasure, Elara. For a moment it felt as if something hung between them, something unspoken. But before she could overthink it, she reached for the door handle. Elara, she paused, looking back at him. I'd like to see you again. Her heart did something strange in her chest. She could have overanalyzed it, questioned why a man like him would be interested in seeing her again. But something about the way he said it steady, certain made her push aside her doubts. A slow smile spread across her lips. I think I'd like that too. As she stepped out of the car, she had the distinct feeling that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. Elara wasn't used to men like Emerson Blackwood. Whatever this was between them, this unexpected shift in her life felt like stepping into a world she hadn't even realized existed. He was effortless in his confidence, magnetic in a way she couldn't quite define, and yet, there was something about him that made her feel entirely too seen. She hadn't expected to hear from him so soon, but the very next evening, her phone buzzed with an invitation. Dinner, not at some crowded restaurant, but at a private rooftop venue. The way he phrased it made it seem less like a question and more like a certainty. And despite every reasonable part of her mind telling her that this was crazy accepting an invitation from a man she barely knew, she found herself saying yes. When she arrived at the address he had sent, she was met by a concierge who led her to a private elevator. The ride up was smooth, almost eerily so, and when the doors slid open, the sight before her stole her breath. The rooftop was transformed into something out of a dream. String lights cast a golden glow over a perfectly set table, and beyond it, the city skyline stretched endlessly, shimmering against the night sky. A soft breeze carried the scent of fresh roses, an entire arrangement of them placed at the center of the table. And there he was. Emerson stood near the edge of the rooftop, hands in his pockets, watching the city as if it belonged to him. When he turned at the sound of her footsteps, something flickered in his eyes, something unreadable yet undeniable. You came, she lifted a shoulder, trying to ignore the way her pulse responded to the warmth in his voice. You make it hard to say no. A slow smile curved his lips. Good. A waiter appeared almost immediately, pulling out her chair with the kind of seamless service that suggested this wasn't just any restaurant. It was something exclusive. Something people waited months, maybe even years to experience. And yet, it was just them. As she sat, she glanced at him, trying to piece together the puzzle that was Emerson Blackwood. You don't do anything halfway, do you? He took his seat across from her, his fingers grazing the stem of his wine glass. Why would I? She let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head. Most people don't plan private rooftop dinners for someone they just met. His gaze held hers. Most people don't intrigue me the way you do. Heat crept up her spine, and she quickly reached for her own glass, taking a sip of the rich red wine. The way he looked at her, it was as if he saw past every layer she carefully kept in place, straight to the heart of her. It was unnerving and exhilarating. As the first course arrived, their conversation drifted into unfamiliar territory. She asked him about his firm, expecting vague replies or rehearsed business talk, but instead he shared pieces of himself she hadn't anticipated. His company wasn't just about investments. It was about control, influence, the difference between those who merely existed in the world and those who shaped it. But that's not why you do it, is it? She asked, watching him closely. He tilted his head slightly. What makes you say that? She set her fork down, considering her words. You could have chosen any path. You didn't build something like this just for power. There's something more. A muscle flexed in his jaw before he leaned back, studying her the way one might examine a puzzle they hadn't expected to be so complex. I grew up watching people lose everything, he said finally. Not because they were reckless, but because they didn't know the rules of the game. I learned early that the world doesn't reward kindness. It rewards those who know how to play. Elara absorbed his words, sensing there was more he wasn't saying. And you decided to be the one making the rules. His lips quirked. Something like that. She exhaled softly, tracing the rim of her glass with her fingertip. That sounds lonely. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. A slight shift, barely noticeable, but there. Loneliness is a byproduct of control. She could tell him that power didn't have to come at the cost of connection, but something told her he had already decided otherwise. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of laughter, conversation, and stolen glances that sent warmth curling in her stomach. By the time the final course was cleared, she felt lighter yet more unsteady than she had in a long time. As he walked her to the elevator, the city lights glowing behind him, she turned to face him, searching for the right words to end the night. "I had a great time," she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. His gaze flickered to the movement before settling back on her. "So did I." There was a beat of silence. A charged moment where the air between them seemed to hum with something unspoken. Then, before she could overthink it, she rose onto her toes and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. It was meant to be simple, a gesture of gratitude. But the second her lips brushed his skin, his hand came up, gently curling around her wrist, holding her there for just a moment longer. When she pulled back, her heart pounded against her ribs. His fingers lingered against her skin before he finally let go. "Good night, Elara." The doors slid shut between them, but even as the elevator descended, she knew one thing for certain: she was already in too deep. Days passed, and with each one, Elara found herself drawn further into Emerson's world. What had started as a chance encounter had turned into something undeniable, something that neither of them seemed willing to resist. He didn't just take her to extravagant dinners. He introduced her to places she had never imagined, experiences that felt like stepping into a dream. One evening, she found herself in the passenger seat of his sleek black car, watching as they pulled up to a sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city. The driveway was lined with towering trees, their leaves rustling in the cool night air. The house, or rather, the mansion, was a masterpiece of glass and stone, its modern architecture blending seamlessly with the natural surroundings. "This is your home?" she asked, barely managing to keep the awe from her voice. Emerson glanced at her before stepping out of the car. "One of them." She followed him up the steps, her heels clicking softly against the marble. The moment they stepped inside, she was hit with the scent of fresh lilies, their fragrance light but unmistakable. A fire crackled in the grand living room, casting golden light across the sleek furnishings. "It's beautiful," she said, turning to take it all in. He watched her, something unreadable in his expression. "I don't bring many people here." There was something in the way he said it, as if this place was more than just a house. As if it was a part of him that he kept hidden from the rest of the world. Elara stepped toward the large windows, her fingers grazing the cool glass as she took in the view. The city lights glittered in the distance, but here, surrounded by quiet and luxury, it felt like another world entirely. He moved beside her, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "I wanted to share this with you." She turned to him, her heart beating in a slow, steady rhythm. "Why?" His gaze didn't waver. "Because you see me not just the wealth or the power, you see me, Elara." Her breath caught in her throat, because he was right. She had seen past the carefully maintained facade, past the effortless confidence and control. She had glimpsed the man beneath it, all the one who had built an empire not for vanity, but for something deeper. And now, standing here in his home, she realized how much he had let her in. She reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "I do see you, Emerson." Something shifted in his expression, a quiet vulnerability that he rarely let show. He lifted their joined hands, pressing a slow, lingering kiss to her knuckles. The moment stretched between them, heavy with something unspoken. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I never expected this." She tilted her head slightly. Expected what? For you to mean this much? The words sent a shiver down her spine, not from fear, but from the intensity of them. Because she felt it too, this growing, undeniable pull between them. It had started as something unexpected, something neither of them had planned for. But now, it was everything. The night unfolded in quiet intimacy, not through grand gestures or extravagant displays, but through stolen glances, soft laughter, and the kind of comfort that came from simply being with someone who understood you. Hours passed, and when she finally rested her head against his shoulder, his arm wrapped around her, holding her close. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she belonged. And as the fire crackled and the city lights shimmered in the distance, one thought settled deep in her heart: she wasn't just falling for Emerson Blackwood. She already had. Elara hadn't expected to wake up in Emerson's home, but when the first rays of morning light filtered through the massive windows, she found herself curled up on the plush sofa, a cashmere throw draped over her shoulders. The quiet hum of the city in the distance was the only sound, and for a moment, she let herself simply exist in the cocoon of warmth and comfort. Then the faint scent of coffee drifted through the air. Pushing the blanket aside, she stretched and rose to her feet, padding toward the open-concept kitchen. Emerson stood at the counter, dressed in dark slacks and a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He moved with an effortless grace, pouring 2 cups of coffee as if he had done this 1,000 times before. He glanced up when he noticed her approach, and something in his expression softened. "Good morning." She hesitated by the granite island, unsure if she was intruding on a routine that wasn't meant for her. But then he slid one of the mugs toward her, a silent invitation. She accepted it, wrapping her fingers around the warm ceramic. "I must have fallen asleep." "You did," he confirmed, leaning casually against the counter. "I didn't want to wake you." She took a cautious sip, the rich taste settling on her tongue. "You really didn't have to let me stay. I wanted to." His tone was simple, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Something about that admission sent a small shiver through her, but she pushed it aside. As they stood there, sipping coffee in the quiet intimacy of the early morning, she realized how easy this felt. There were no grand speeches, no unnecessary pleasantries. Just the quiet understanding between two people who had unexpectedly found themselves tangled in something neither had planned for. After a moment, Emerson set his cup down and regarded her with a thoughtful expression. "I have an event tonight, a charity gala. I'd like you to come with me." The offer caught her off guard. "A gala," he nodded. "It's something I host every year, a fundraiser for education programs." She hesitated, feeling an odd mix of flattery and apprehension. "Are you sure you want me there?" "I mean, I don't exactly run in those circles." His gaze didn't waver. "You don't have to. I want you there because I want to share this part of my life with you." The sincerity in his voice left little room for argument. She studied him for a moment before nodding. "Okay, I'll go." A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes, but he simply gave a satisfied tilt of his head. "I'll have something arranged for you." She opened her mouth to protest, but the look he gave her made it clear that this wasn't up for debate. Hours later, a sleek black car arrived outside her apartment, carrying with it a carefully wrapped gown in a garment bag. The fabric was smooth beneath her fingertips, and when she slipped into it that evening, the transformation was undeniable. The deep emerald dress hugged her curves in all the right places, cascading down in elegant folds. The moment she stepped into the waiting car, she couldn't help but feel like she was stepping into another world entirely. And then there was Emerson. When she arrived at the gala, he was already waiting at the grand entrance, dressed in a tailored black tuxedo that fit him with effortless precision. The moment his eyes landed on her, something flickered in his expression, something unmistakable. "You look breathtaking," he said, his voice lower than usual. Heat crept up her neck, but she held his gaze, You don't look so bad yourself. A rare smile tugged at his lips before he extended his arm. Shall we? She looped her hand through his, allowing him to guide her inside. The ballroom was a masterpiece of opulence, glittering chandeliers casting golden light over elegantly dressed guests. Servers moved seamlessly through the crowd, offering champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. Elara felt the weight of curious eyes on her, whispers barely concealed behind raised glasses. "You're causing quite the stir," she murmured to Emerson as they made their way through the room. He didn't appear the slightest bit concerned. Let them wonder. The evening passed in a blur of introductions, polite conversations, and stolen glances between them. But it wasn't until later, when they stood on the balcony overlooking the city, that the weight of the night settled between them. "You thrive in this world," she observed, watching him. He exhaled slowly. "It's a necessary part of what I do, but it's not what defines me." She turned to look at him fully. "Then what does?" He regarded her for a long moment before reaching for her hand. His fingers traced the inside of her wrist, slow and deliberate. "You," he said simply. The air between them shifted, something deep and undeniable settling into place. Before she could overthink it, he leaned in, his lips brushing hers in a kiss that was both tender and possessive. It wasn't hurried or rushed, it was deliberate, like he was claiming something that had been inevitable from the start. When they finally pulled apart, she let out a shaky breath. "I never expected this," he admitted, his forehead resting against hers. She smiled softly. "Neither did I." But as the city lights flickered below them, she realized something. She didn't want to fight it anymore. She was his, and he was hers. And for the first time in a long time, she knew exactly where she belonged. The night lingered in Elara's mind long after the final guests had left the gala. Emerson had held her close as they danced beneath the shimmering chandeliers, his touch grounding her in a reality that still felt surreal. But now, as dawn stretched across the horizon, she found herself in his car once more, the city slowly waking around them. Neither of them spoke for a long time, the silence between them thick with the weight of something unspoken. Emerson's hand rested on the leather-wrapped steering wheel, his fingers tapping lightly, a rare show of restlessness from a man who always seemed in control. Finally, he glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Come with me," Elara blinked, caught off guard. "Where?" "Home," he said simply. The word settled deep in her chest, a slow warmth spreading through her. He wasn't just talking about the mansion or the penthouse suites he undoubtedly owned. He meant something more, something deeper, and she wanted it. She nodded. The drive took them beyond the city, where towering buildings gave way to sprawling landscapes. Emerson's estate was even more breathtaking in the morning light, the massive windows reflecting the golden hues of the sky. Inside, the house was quiet, but not in a lonely way. It felt lived in, despite its immaculate design. Elara wandered through the grand living space, her fingertips grazing the smooth wood of the bookshelves lining one wall. Titles on philosophy, economics, and history filled the shelves, but there were also art books, novels, things she hadn't expected. Emerson stood behind her, watching. "I don't think I've ever had someone here who actually stopped to look." She turned to face him. "Maybe you needed someone too." A flicker of something passed through his gaze, but instead of replying, he reached for her hand, leading her through the house. They ended up in the sunroom, where floor-to-ceiling windows let in the soft morning light. A small table was already set for breakfast, fresh coffee steaming in delicate porcelain cups. Elara arched a brow. "You planned this?" His lips curved slightly. "I might have asked the staff to prepare something." She sat, watching as he did the same. The intimacy of the moment struck her, the way he poured her coffee without asking how she liked it, as if he had already memorized the details. As they ate, conversation flowed effortlessly. He told her stories about his travels, the places he had visited not as a billionaire investor, but as a man searching for something beyond boardrooms and financial statements. She told him about the small town she had grown up in, the late nights spent sketching designs in the margins of her school notebooks. At one point, he reached across the table, brushing his thumb over the back of her hand. "I don't do this, Elara." She looked at him, her heart pounding. "Do what? This?" His voice was quieter now, almost hesitant. "Let someone in." She held his gaze, feeling the full weight of what he was saying. He wasn't just offering her a glimpse into his world, he was offering her a place in it, and she wasn't afraid to take it. That day stretched into another, and then another. What had begun as an unexpected encounter turned into something neither of them could deny. Emerson remained the same commanding, confident man, but with her, there was an ease, a softness that he rarely showed the world. One evening, as they walked through the vast gardens of his estate, he stopped abruptly, turning to face her. "I want you here, Elara," he said, his voice steady, "not just for a night. Not just for a moment." She stared at him, her heart in her throat. "Are you asking me to move in?" he exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "I'm asking you to stay in whatever way you want. I just don't want a life without you in it." Tears burned at the edges of her vision, but she refused to let them fall. Instead, she stepped closer, placing her hands against his chest. "You don't have to convince me, Emerson," she whispered. "I already belong here." With a low breath, he pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he never planned to let go, and he wouldn't. There were no doubts, no hesitations. They had found each other against all odds, and neither of them had any intention of letting go. As the stars blinked into existence above them, Emerson pressed a slow, lingering kiss to her lips, sealing a promise between them. Not one of wealth or power, but of something far more valuable. "Forever,"